Отлично. Добрый день, дорогие друзья. Спасибо вам за интерес к нашему проекту. Сегодня мы запускаем проект Utalks, который пройдет вместе с Университетом креативных индустрий. Это совместный проект с Отделом культуры и образования Посольства Великобритании в Москве и Immersive Imaging, первым университетом креативных индустрий в России. Мы запускаем цикл бесплатных онлайн-лекций в рамках Международного года креативной экономики в целях устойчивого развития, который был объявлен ООН. И мы рады сообщить о том, что это первый цикл, который пройдет вместе с Посольством Великобритании. Да, и в течение года к нам смогут подсоединиться коллеги из других стран. Мы стартуем с прекрасной темы, посвященной мета-навыкам будущего, что важно развивать уже сейчас, чтобы успешно интегрироваться в будущее. И наш сегодняшний спикер Адам Браун, старший преподаватель кафедры фотографии Школы искусств и креативных индустрий Университета London-South University. Он выставляющийся художник, лауреат международных премий, и его работы опубликованы во многих интересных изданиях. Наш модератор Соня Смыслова, программный руководитель School of Education University. Спасибо большое за то, что вы смогли присоединиться, поучаствовать в этой беседе. Хочу передать слово вам. И я хочу напомнить всем, что есть прекрасная возможность задать вопросы спикеру, и Адам будет рад на них ответить в течение всей беседы. Поэтому, пожалуйста, если у вас есть вопросы, пишите их в чат-боксе, и Адам с удовольствием на них ответит. Спасибо большое. Соня, слово тебе.
Hi, everyone. I will start with English if you forgive me. So, Adam, I'm very, very happy to share with you this conversation and to start this lecture.
Thank you.
I will be very grateful if you share your experience and your point of view of what is soft skill is, what is meta skills is, what's the difference, what's important or what not. And I will provide some opportunity to discuss some questions from me or from audience. So be active, please. Ask your question, ask them in a top Q&A. So let's go on. And Adam, let's start.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope everyone is well and looking after themselves at this point in time. It's very important to keep an eye out for each other. It's a good question about soft skills. My subject, which I've been teaching since 1993, is photography and media arts. So I kind of started very much on the teaching the hard skills, developing film, printing in a darkroom, exposure, and working in a studio, and kind of really cut my teeth on technical stuff. Moving on to becoming a studio manager and educationalist in a studio in South London called Photo Fusion for 6 years. And, you know, my main feeling at that point was about making stuff, saw myself very much as a maker. Moving into higher education, I've been in higher education now since sort of 2003, teaching photography, media arts, across a whole range of disciplines. And most of my experience has been interdisciplinary. That's something I specialise on, so mixing disciplines together. What I find is the students come in expecting, as I was teaching, hard skills, how to do this, how to do that, how to sort of create a piece of work using a particular technique. But what gets them the jobs and what gets them the progression at the end is their ability to transform at those 3 years and mature into somebody who sees the value of soft skills such as communication, networking, empathy, and the ability to forge links with other people. And that means that over the course of the degree on which I teach, students transition from being very, very into the particular individual thing they're creating and how good they are at it, which is necessary. And then gradually they sort of, we work to bring them together into collaborative groups. And it's that stuff which opens up the career pathways for them. They go on to become, you know, suddenly a whole range of careers opens up. Everybody begins wanting to be a freelance photographer, but then they leave and they become studio managers, production managers, liaison, working in the picture desk of a newspaper or magazine, and working with others, curator, commissioner, gallerist, etc., etc. So suddenly what was a very narrow career path becomes an incredibly broad one.
What do you think the extra benefits are given to students when they trying to achieve their professional skills or upgrade their professional skills in more interdisciplinary way that I'm talking about? Are there any kind of extra opportunities or extra benefits, even in today's world economy, maybe worldwide economy?
Well, the disciplines are kind of breaking down. I think people do hold on to the old disciplinary boundaries, photography in particular. There are some people who definitely identify as photographers, but they're increasingly specializing in very niche markets. My colleagues and I are continually being requested to do video, to work within the context of the web. So the presentation that I prepared for you is entitled "It's All Group Work," in the sense that no matter what you do, you are working in a team. And really this idea of the lone practitioner is something that it's pushed via social media quite a lot. There's a lot of pressure on people to work as individuals and see themselves as sole traders and individual businesses and to be completely self-contained. But when they map the links with the people who are actually helping them make it happen, you can see that people are kind of moving forward as teams, even if they don't think they are. I think that's some of the realization that students have.
Yeah, that's very, very important, because nowadays it's more common to be self-alone, like a standalone, self-employed specialist. So do all the job or sometimes all our job alone. And that's why it will be very great if you share some stories about your teamwork, your group work with your students. I know you prepared a lot of great cases, so please share them with us and tell us how with the group work can be different aspects are involved.
Great, I will do. Let me just go to the front of the slides and wait a second. Is that visible to everybody? Yeah.
Everything is great. Yeah, we can see a screen, so you can. Okay,
so you can see the screen. It's all group work. That's one thing. It's a typical kind of teacher thing, like, oh right, no, it's all that, Okay, so the course that we sort of pride ourselves on a course identity which is creative and industrially focused, and LSBU, we kind of cast that net pretty broad. So what is industrial includes the fine art, includes the commercial, includes fashion, advertising. It's really cross-genre working. So students don't tend to they specialize, but there's no house style. So they choose what they want to specialize in, and then we encourage them to deepen their understanding of it by working with a whole range of professionals who we employ in those different genres, but also self-motivated research. So teaching themselves about what current practice is in their chosen destination. This is a piece of work by Emily Carver, and this is a project. We work a lot with live briefs. So we work a lot with industry-focused briefs, and in the second and third year, and where we can the first year, what we do is we organise projects where students aren't just handing work into a lecturer, but they're presenting them in a real-life situation, and then we assess them on their competence and understanding of that situation. In the background, we have this organisation called the South Bank Collective, which is an agency which LSBU started in LSBU by my colleague Daniel Alexander a few years ago now, by the photography department, in order to take on commissions for clients. And the reason why this happened, it's great that it happened, because if anyone who's kind of worked in education knows, people are always ringing up and emailing saying, hey, I've got a photography job and you've got a bunch of students who work for nothing. Please, can you send them my way to do a job for me? And of course, this is naked exploitation. And we take a very dim view of that, because what it does is it undercuts the wages of people in the industry. So Daniel started the South Bank Collective so that if anybody approaches us with a job, we can then get the students to organise the job. They have to act as client liaison, production management, studio management, retouching, etc., etc. So they have to manage the entire workflow of a photographic job. This is something that a first year coming into the course doesn't understand, because they think a photographer is just a lone wolf. But of course, any photographer who's succeeding in the profession has a crew behind them. It's a collaborative it's a collaborative process of working. They'll be working with a retoucher, they'll be working with a studio manager or a producer in order to make something happen. So the students get introduced to those roles and they get to do them live on the course by participating in the South Bank Collective. And that's great. And this is how we get students to actually, and they get paid for it as well. They actually get paid proper money. So they go through to graduation having actually done paid work in a real live industry structure. And the soft skills are totally important, because you cannot be a prima donna, you cannot be a diva. You have to be completely businesslike. You have to handle people with respect. You have to be able to properly be prompt, be organized, be on your toes, to anticipate your clients' needs. And it's those things that really carry people forward and accelerate them into the industry, as well as good quality technical skill. So that's the SBC. Second year, we have two really good live projects. The first semester of the second year, the students organise an exhibition of their work, and they do everything. They organise the entire show. We pay for the space, but they, as well as producing individual pieces of work, as you can see, what they do is they organise the exhibition, they fundraise for it, they publicise it, they do all the social media, they do all the legal side of it, they organise insurance, they do the lot. So everything is organised by them. So they learn what it is that you have to do to organise an art show. And on the way, we ask them to write reports. We organise group meetings, and I was organising this year the professional practice component of this module. So we would have regular meetings with the design team, the publicity team, the fundraising team. We ran a really successful Kickstarter campaign, and we did all of this over Zoom in the middle of a raging pandemic. So it was all good fun. It was really touch and go. We didn't know this year whether the show was going to happen, because we don't know whether the gallery was going to be under lockdown. We had to do all the clearance. We had to open an Eventbrite page, so people who came along had to book in groups of 3, so they didn't burst into any bubbles. They kept a protective distance from each other, and it all worked wonderfully well. And I think our approach, because it's based on modelling what's happened in the industry, myself and Daniel and the tutors on the course have been looking at what the industry has been doing to adapt to COVID, and then following that model. And the students come along and they go, well, this is what, instead of going, oh, my college experience is now horrible, what they do is, this is what the industry is doing, so this is what we're doing. And when this is all over, hypothetically, what will happen is that those changes that the industry have gone through are now part of our everyday practice. So it's just by being focused on what's happening in the real world, that thing meshes really well, and that's why we are able to have a successful show. So we have things, they don't just produce photographs, they organise a panel discussion. So this is Franklin Rogers, who's a fantastic photographer, and also Lou Bowen from the agency Making Pictures, giving a talk to people. So as well as an exhibition, there's an event. So they have to organise an event. They have to sort of get tickets organised, and speakers, and projection, PA system, invite people down, propose a series of questions, just like the process I've just been through for this talk. So those are really key professional skills that they get. And some of them, this is what gives them employment at the end. We also have a second year module called self-publishing in the photo book, where they have to publish an artist's photo book, and they produce some really kind of very imaginative, very creative, very artistic books that don't look like books at all. They're kind of printed on all sorts of interesting papers, and as you can see, some of them are packaged in ways that are very creative. So the work itself can go wild, but they have to organise a shop. So then they have to publicise it, they have to promote it, they do all the things that they did for the gallery project. And what was great about this particular cohort of students, some of whom actually went on to be publishers themselves, they organised guest talks where they talked about their work, and people were invited to come and hear them speak. So that was wonderful. So they can be as wild and artistic as possible, but then they have to ground that with a presentation to people. So my interest in group work and interdisciplinary working goes back years, but one of the best experiences was working in Australia at James Cook University with Mitch Goodwin, Katja Fleischman, and Ryan Daniel. And they've created a model of working in the third year. This was a BA honours, it's a BA media arts, Bachelor of Media Arts course, and it was an interdisciplinary course that brought together students from the specialisms of graphic design, sound design, film production, photography, and a whole range of other disciplines. And they were doing major or minors in various different subjects. Katya and Mitch put together this fantastic kind of idea called the pool model. So in the third year, what the students had to do was to produce a business model of a business formed from a collaborative team. So they formed little groups of 5 or 6 students, all with different range of skills, some photographers, some sound recordists, some designers, and then put forward a business plan and actually make a model and actually do it for real. And it was wonderful because then they realised the role of each other in collaborating with each other in negotiation, organisation, timekeeping, etc., and how they could share their skills and things they'd never thought of before. And again, when they're sort of liaising with the industry and putting these things out into the real world, they were actually getting feedback from real live audiences about work they were doing for uni. So that was great. There's a whole theme. I'll share the references with you at the end. I've produced a kind of reference list of the text I'm working from. But that was wonderful, really good experience, really lively. And once you'd sort of given them that kind of impetus to get started, they just boiled over with energy. They enjoyed that so much, and so did I. I guess because we were working in far north Queensland in remote Australia, it's up in Townsville, which is about 1,000 kilometres north of Brisbane. So it's right on the edge of the tropics. Well, it is the tropics. There's the wet tropics. The rainforest starts just sort of 10 miles north. But we used to sort of jet guest speakers in via Skype. This is a friend of mine, Gareth Polmere, who it's like 3 o'clock in the morning in London, but he was happy to give a lecture at that point in time about film practice. So they're looking at Bertoldspan with a movie camera. But this is I love this shot because it really shows everything about the kind of networked working environment we were in. You know, we have the Skype projection of Gareth. We've got the students working at the machines. We've got the outback behind the window, and we've got the movie on the screen. It's just, this is what it was like there. It was very networked, and that was wonderful. I was very keen on augmented reality and kind of I used a lot of stuff with Arduinos, immersive projection, interactive things with touch screens and pressure pads. And for the third year project, Immersive Imaging, we formed teams of students who made projects such as this. This is a room where there's pressure pads underneath the carpet, and when you tread on the pressure pads, the audio tracks play from this projection, depending on the object that you're next to, whether it's a clock or a radio or a TV. And it shows a domestic room through different time periods. So the room changes, and this is composed entirely in Photoshop, and the pressure pads were controlled by Arduino. It was so much fun and very ambitious, but with a good team and good discipline and good organisation. If all the pieces fit together, you can just do so much more. So again, soft skills are to the fore here. And this was the other one which simulated a rainstorm in northern Queensland. There are loads of those, massive thunderstorms and completely torrential deluges. And it was a very wild place, but they tried to simulate a thunderstorm in the galleries when you walked in. Loads of flashbulbs popped off, controlled by pressure pads, and rain appeared to fall from the ceiling. So that was a lot of fun. One of the theories I'm working towards, I did my PGCE, I did 2 PGCEs, and I studied group work a lot, and I'll give you some references for that. But one of the things that really caught my imagination back in 2006 were the ideas of actor network theorists like Bruno Latour, Michel Calon, John Law, and this idea that the objects have agency, which was a very current and still very influential theory. I read Bruno Latour's We've Never Been Modern and sort of devoured that book. And I thought, well, what happens when you expand group work to include machines? So a lot of my work in following this insight was to try and do group work in network situations, so that as well as the human networks, we also thought about what the machines are asking us to do. So instead of considering technology to be a tool, if you consider technology to have a certain agency or a set of affordances, it gets you to do something, it forces you to behave in a certain way. it opens up the door to understanding what it is you're doing in a workshop. And I've found, contrarily, that if you ignore what the machine is asking you to do, then it has a power that you're not acknowledging in the room. So Mecha Critique was a term I kind of came up with, which it's about the kind of reflexive process of working with a machine in the workshop. Some examples of that: we have at London South Bank, we have a first year module called Digital Image Construction, and we get students to take part in a 15-minute timed exercise in which they have literally they have to put up the lights, take the shot, take it down, download the images, and exit the studio in 15 minutes. And they're working with a total stranger, so it's not one of their friends. So they come into the studio and they have to plan this thing beforehand, and they have to get into role. And it's really important that they understand the roles of photographer, first assistant and second assistant, and how this, and map out a plan of how they're going to communicate with each other. Now, of course, when everybody comes into the course, they all want to be the photographer, and it's a real shock to them to sort of have to put themselves into a role where they're not the photographer. But what happens is that as they go through this process of setting this up and planning for it, the role of the second assistant becomes increasingly important, because it's that person who makes the model feel comfortable. It's that person who solves the issues on set. It's that person who is the glue between everything else that's going on in the scenario. And that way, once the students realize what's going on, they understand how connected the photographer is to everybody else in the room. And there is no hierarchy of roles in terms of the work of getting the job done. In terms of the machinery will talk back to you. It will rebel. It's you can hide behind a camera as much as you can use it as an expressive tool. So it forces people to put the technology in its place and think about the human relationships in the room. This is great. This was a module called Expanded Photographic Practice. And what we did in this instance, I put the students into groups and asked them to workshop scenarios where they took portraits of each other. But instead of posing, there had to be an act of role play, and there was a totally free brief. They could do what they liked. And Megan and Bethany came up with this amazing scenario where they got their team together to take portraits of them, and Bethany gave Megan her mobile phone, and she scrolled through her social media feed while she sat there and watched, and then they swapped the phones again. So we had this amazing series of portraits where you're looking at trust and you're looking at boundaries being crossed live on set, and it was just the most amazing thing because the dynamic in that room was great. So this is what I mean by Mecha Critique. You've just got this powerful technology, which is people are networking, but you can catch people's responses to it. It changes the way you behave. You become a kind of hybrid of machine and person. So and also human interactions, trust, empathy, soft skills. Sometimes we talk about technology as it's erasing our soft skills. I prefer to think of it as remapping. This was another second year project. Again, this is from collaborative practice, a group project, an interdisciplinary team with students from film practice, photography, sound design, and a couple of other disciplines. And they organised a street studio in the centre of London in St Christopher's Place. And they invited people to come along and have their profile picture taken by a professional photographer, in this case Jake. And then they would, in the background, a team including Indrek, who's a fantastic student, did all the kind of retouching live. So the first stage of the process was to have the portrait taken. The second stage of the process was to have it retouched, and then you could have a digitally retouched image. But what they did was they took the portrait, and then in the background, Indrek and the team were asking the clients, they were saying, well, how would you like to be improved? Because he's a whiz on Photoshop, he can do pretty much anything. How could we perfect your image? And they think for a minute and then say, okay, well, let's, could you just sort of reshape my face a little bit? Or, I don't like the shape of my chin, can you give me a different jawline? Or could you change my skin tone? Could you retouch the freckles? And what, of course, happens is that they're seeing an image of themselves perfected. And for some of them, this has actually turned out to be quite a distressing process. They're going, well, all this is proving to me is how imperfect I am. I don't like this. I prefer the first picture. Thank you very much. And I teach the theory side of the course as well. So I teach first year essays, second semester I teach dissertation. And a lot of students choose to write academically about retouching, culture of fake, the way in which Photoshop is changing the way we see our bodies, etc., etc. But what I liked about this was it was a piece of enacted theory that happened live in the street. So all those questions about fakeness, imperfection, happened when you put the act of photoshopping something live into a public situation, the conversations just opened up. So what was previously a discussion that would have happened on paper or happened in a lecture suddenly became a conversation you had live in the street, in the middle of a busy shopping centre, and you could actually do something about it. So it's a wonderful piece of enacted theory. But again, that's what happens when you take that stuff outside. And you do it for real. Documentation is important. Students are making projects. Part of this is one of the best things that happened this year. Gertruda Samasco, who's third year photography, did a piece of video projection because we couldn't access the campus. We decided to let them do street projects. So the whole third year midway show took place in the streets surrounding South Bank Uni. And Gertruda projected a video of a fridge with some strangely morphing and slightly grotesque contents onto the wall of the building. But what was great about this is the way that she had to involve a whole team of fellow students in producing this. So she had to persuade them. This is some of the early stages of the project where she did all the testing with groups of people holding, projectors and umbrellas because it was raining at this point in London, as you might imagine. But also the documentation was super important, the way in which she got people to actually make a record of the event, because as this thing happens, it's very dramatic and, it needs to be recorded. So everybody got a slice of the pie. Everybody was involved in documenting this thing. It's a wonderful piece of intervention art in the middle of a lockdown. So we did all right there, I think. Other collaborations. This is the first year project from Australia. And here we worked with a local architect in Townsville called Stephen de Jersey. He was the client and he did the kind of briefing, midpoint review and the final crit. But the students formed teams and they did a collective Photoshop panorama. So they went around the city and they collected the individual assets. They made all the assets and comped them all together. And usually in the first year, students work solo on technical projects, but this was trying to teach technique by forming them into groups. So they had discussions and conversations between themselves about the project. And then again, so right from the outset, when the first point in the first year where you're teaching the technical skills, that can be done in a group work scenario. That can be done in such a way that you're forging the group as a production team. So they get that message right from the off that this is what they're supposed to be doing on the course. So a couple of, really beautiful imaginings of the city. A couple of references for you, and then I'll hand over to questions. This is a book which influenced me a great deal. It's called Facilitating Reflective Learning in Higher Education by Brockbank and McGill. And I encountered this book when I was doing my PGCE. And they really emphasize the complexity of human communication and how it's not a one-on-one process, but there are always more than two people in any form of communication. It's a network. What are the qualities they privilege? Realness or genuineness, absolutely important. Trust and empathy, and those kind of skills. I'll show you how this kind of works. A couple of diagrams that they kind of introduced me to, which are really effective. Some of you may know this concept. Anybody? Things that are known to yourself and things that are unknown to yourself, and how disclosure and working in these teams shifts that perception. So things that you didn't know about yourself, suddenly you're aware of in the process of giving and receiving feedback to others. So this is really valuable in terms of modelling how a student project goes forward and those points at which you give and receive feedback. I get one example that comes out of this. I get the second years to at the end of the second year, when they know each other, I get them to get together in little groups and write potted biographies of the other students to describe their practice, because the idea is that everybody has an artistic identity, but you don't necessarily know what that is until somebody plays it back to you. So the students form little teams, they workshop each other's group identities, and then they share that with each other. And there's a kind of moment of revelation where they all realize what the other people think their work is about. And they're like, oh my goodness me, I didn't know that that was what my work was about. And suddenly it becomes really clear that they've made some statement which they didn't know they'd made. They work in triads. This is an important part of the way in which Brock McGill proposed reflective learning to happen. The presenter is the person who's made the project, the enabler is the person who's been on that journey with them, and the reporter is there to feed back to them and sort of replay what's happened, because in that moment when somebody is communicating feedback to you, you're so tuned into your effective response that sometimes it's really hard to hear it. So when you give and receive feedback in a group, and you have somebody else with you who's able to report that or accurately record that, then the process becomes far more useful, far more objective, because you have two people listening to the same information. And of course, when I saw your questions, I was interested because, through my career, a lot of people have sort of said, well, how are you preparing students for the industry? And within academia, within the university, there's very much this idea that the university kind of like we're all kind of muddling along, but industry is where it already happens. And my experience sort of getting students into the industry is that sometimes the industry is absolute hell. It's a really difficult place to work. People with horrendous attitudes. I've seen students exploited. I've seen people have discrimination. I've seen all sorts of things. The university is a space where you can actually have conversations about ethics without getting sacked, which is really important. And, there's a way in which, if we model these things, that I see what we do in the university as taking inclusive practice and being able to go into the industry and bring some of that insight. The industry can be very competitive, and people can be so competitive they forget that they're dealing with human beings. They can push people beyond their limits. They can, it can be incredibly hard. But you don't want to prepare students to accept bad practice. You want them to be able to bring the challenge. You want them to be able to say, well, this is wrong. I don't want to subject myself to this. This is one of the biggest soft skills you can have, is to know when you're being exploited and when to say no, and when to look after yourself. And especially in these times, I can't model what my students' experience is because I come from a different generation. I hear their stories and I understand the truth of what they're saying, and when they replay that back to me, I'm like, well, you should not have accepted that situation. You shouldn't have let somebody do that to you. So when we liaise with the industry, we bring that check on those kind of practices. We also bring inclusivity. In terms of preparing yourself, there's a lot of soft racism that happens. A lot of people who pretend to be a different class, pretend to be a different skin color, pretend to be a different kind of person in order to get the job. And we're kind of like aware that this is happening. And how do you prepare students to almost deal with the violence of having to be another person in order to secure a role? It's a difficult question. So returning to my opening statement, everything is group work. Yeah, contemporary media tells us we're individuals, but you can map how contemporary media is producing that idea of individuality as an effect. It's almost trying to form us individuals and make us forget the ways in which we're connected. So we do emphasize collaborative working with technology in order to make sure that even though you think you're doing something individually, you're still connected. You always remain connected. And this was a workshop I did on ethical practice and group work, where I got students to produce an imaginary production plan, and they had to imagine they were students with particular life circumstances, and then I gave them a register which showed that some people had certain blips and non-attendances, and they had to stage a meeting like a production meeting, but they didn't know what the life circumstances of the other students were. And then after they had this meeting, all calling each other lazy and saying, well, you're late, you can get out of bed, could you? But what they didn't understand is that at the end, they all opened up the envelopes and they revealed what their life circumstances were. And they'd been forced to model what a person with difficult circumstances would have encountered in the job. Now, people going out into the industry, you know, it's like that. You need to be able to stand up for yourself. You need to be respectful of people's life circumstances. And you need to spot when exploitation is happening. So that, to some extent, it prepared them for that experience. And to get away from this idea that if somebody's not attending, automatically they're lazy. You know, that at any point in the game, there will be a reason why somebody's life circumstances will interfere with their work, and how to look after yourself, how to defend yourself, how to prepare yourself for that situation. So rewiring the group to be inclusive, and actually after this, the teams worked incredibly well. The inspiration for this was Ryan Daniel at JCU, who did a fantastic role play. He came from a kind of theatre background. I think he had some amazing kind of role play workshop where students role played this live in the studio. So that was great. I'll leave it there, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I suppose we can proceed with some question. And as you finished on these parts, I really want to share that once I was visiting a Buddhist monastery, and there was a game over there when you were trying to guess someone's emotions by filling the gaps in the list. So it was like empathy workshop when you were trying to understand what kind of emotions other people feeling. And, even though lots of people there weren't speaking even English, nobody could understand what feeling another one, and we always misunderstood the emotions of our partner. So it was very interesting. It's a little bit remind me about the workshop you just shared. Thank you very much for this story. We have some questions from the audience, and I start with maybe a general one. What do you think, how student skills and demand on student skills changed for past, 5 or 10 years? What has changed through the period of time? And are there any kind of future statements, future vision for what kind of specific soft skills will be needed in nearest future? What do you think about that? Okay.
I mean, the future's going through a difficult period at the moment, isn't it? What is going to the future's not what it used to be.
I definitely agree.
So in the past, I would have insisted on independence, self-management, self-education. But increasingly, I think I can only talk about a UK context. I can only talk about the difference between coming from a situation in which there was much more support for individuals within society. There was more benefit system was different, the welfare system was different, and coming into a situation now where a lot of that has been taken away, students have to be a lot more self-reliant. And I think the skill of looking out for each other and supporting each other is very important. Students are no longer moving out of home and renting flats. What they're doing is they're living with their family until they're 30, because it's impossible to get on the housing ladder in the UK. So families are forming into sort of protective units where they can. And the upshot of that is that students are, if they are moving out of home, it's because they have to, or because there are kind of issues there, or they're wealthy enough to be able to do that. So the students who move away from home to university either have huge issues, or they're very well supported. But you can't make assumptions about what that's about. You have to be very careful. So that empathy is really important, because in any given group, you don't know what challenges people are facing. And that would be the same in work as it is in education. The soft skills would be really important, such as keeping your confidence up. Managing anxiety is a big one. Learning how to sort of see things, put things in a bigger picture. Confidence, if you're sort of walking into a room and trying to sort of get a contract from a client, that's all about confidence. But if you're burning with anxiety about your life situation, you're not going to be able to do that. So I think one of the other soft skills is to objectively measure your achievements and to be able to see the value of what you've done, and to be able to take a measured view of your own confidence and to be able to identify when somebody is faking it, I think, for sure. Social media is wonderful and terrible at the same time. It promotes the idea that you can get something for nothing. It promotes the idea that you can become instantly famous and wealthy overnight. It sells that to you. One of the other soft skills is to realize how that's a 1 in a million thing, and when you're actually being, you know what I mean? They're obsessed with it because they see these things happening and hear these stories, but it's a game.
Okay, and proceeding with this question a little bit further, there is a question about remote teams. You mentioned that when we work in online, we can. It's harder for us to understand what kind of emotions and what kind of context is following the students, and what can we do with the remote teams when we even do not see each other offline, like visually. So are there any kind of tips you can recommend how to proceed with this kind of a teams, fully digital one?
That's been one of the hardest things about this year is the work you have to put in to build a group dynamic. Whereas before students would meet on campus and they'd meet in a range of social situations, now you kind of have to model that for them. My students were lucky in the first semester because they were able to come on campus and meet each other just for practical lessons. Everything else was online, so they bonded that way. But the group work has been one of the hardest things this year. And I think what made it work was we did a little bit of that in second semester where I was putting them into teams and I gave them the choice of either self-selecting or being guided into a team. You know, either sort of, because normally I would sort of go through a voting process and there would be a whole kind of democratic process by which projects were decided, but because we couldn't really take any measure of each individual student's level of engagement, it had to be there had to be like a get-out clause. There had to be a way in which students would accept being put onto teams in different ways, and everybody seemed to find that okay. It's important to make time online for people to freely associate. That's one of the biggest things, is to let them chat. And I've been doing workshops where I just say to them, look, I'm just going to the kitchen for 15 minutes. You just talk amongst yourselves. And then they just talk amongst themselves. And then I come back and suddenly they've got something to say. The problem with the Zoom environment is that you're constantly watching them and they feel constantly watched. So if you make an excuse and disappear for 10 minutes, that actually has great educational significance because suddenly they feel free in a way that they would do. You have to reproduce that experience on campus. That's something that Jonathan Shaw said in the last educational conference as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And a little bit more question. There are lots of them in our chat. So do you know the borderline between soft skills and hard skills? Or maybe you interpreted it somehow for yourself, because we know that there is no like strict borderline between this type of skills. So different research groups say different things about them, or can you share what's your understanding, what the difference between these two groups of skills? How do you understand
the
it for
difference
yourself?
between soft skills and hard skills? Well, sort of with my interest in actor network theory and and social constructivism, for me, I can see how the camera, and talking about photography, cameras make you behave a certain way. A photographer is a performer. It's a role that you get into, and the machine enables you to take a particular role and enact a particular relationship with other people. So if I get students to realize that when they pick up the camera, they're actually stepping into a role and they're behaving in a certain way because that piece of kit makes them do that, because it's designed for a certain purpose, then they start to understand that everything that they do is a soft skill in that sense. In terms of doing something procedurally, if you talk about a process, you've got to carve out space for that. Part of what I was talking to the first years the other day under lockdown is teaching or talking to them about the importance of being assertive and claiming space to enable them to concentrate on certain things. And that effective work of actually clearing the space to work on your hard skills is part of what makes things happen. And if you can't do that, it's incredibly difficult. So where does that begin or end? If you're unable to tell your family to leave the room to allow you to do your Photoshop or your Premiere or your After Effects practice, where does that begin or end? Part of the hard skill or acquiring that hard skill is clearing the room or being able to negotiate with other people about where that begins and ends. I guess, but I kind of, for me, what actor network theory proposes is that machines are just, frozen human intentions in a way, or the way in which, how can I put it, a human action or a human decision has been rendered material and been given to a machine or delegated to a piece of equipment. That doesn't make it any the less human. It just means that you have to look at it a certain way. That's probably a very philosophical answer. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting. I mean, that's why I'm asking about your own interpretation, because if your answer more generally about that's one of professional, another one about people connection, it won't be so interesting. That's why it was interesting, your understanding accordingly to your professional field.
I like going into a studio while they're taking the shots and go, you're playing a role now, you're in character now. And they go, oh, I didn't realize I was. I like making them realize how, because suddenly they picked up this thing, that they've changed. They're a different person. I'm like, you're a different person. You're not the same person who walked in the room. And why is that? Think about why that happens. Like, who is this? And why did this person become that way? Just because you've got this thing in your hand,
After all these transformations, do your teams follow with working together after the graduation? Have you some cases of students' teams proceed with working in like a team of specialists in industry together after graduation?
There's a couple of examples of students forming little exhibiting groups. Or one group formed an agency and tried to get work in the dance music scene in London. So yeah, they do that.
Great.
Normally driven by 2 or 3 dynamic individuals. They're small groups. You know what I mean? They tend to be smaller groups. I think it's very easy for a collaborative duo to establish themselves. 3 people, slightly more loose, but those bigger groups tend to split up. But yeah, but they definitely feed off each other. I do tell them that what they do is they're constantly giving each other jobs, and having, I keep a kind of social media feed of whenever I move on from an institution, I friend all the people I'm no longer employed to teach on Facebook. So I've got kind of like in touch with people who I taught back in 2003, 2007, and seen their trajectory. And then I look at what they've been doing and how they're communicating with each other. And even if they're not working in teams, they have social networks going on and they provide each other with support for their careers through that.
Okay. There are some questions about art education in generally. The first one is about speed of information accelerating and constantly rising amount of information we have around. Do you think that your students need to somehow get up with the speed? I mean, be always in like newest trends, understand the whole information, search a lot, or you sometimes make them to be more slower, to understand their own pathway, understand their own trajectory, their own like speed of consuming or any kind of information. How do you teach them to understand their own speed of processes, of art processes? Because there's lots of techniques and practices, and I don't know.
That's a really good question. Of course, the part of the knowledge economy is encouraging you to be constantly productive. I do talk to them about, writers and strategies who talk about the anxiety of living under this accelerated system. and how part of it is designed to, you know, make you more productive or to stay in a constant state of alertness in order to keep feeding content into the machine. So we have some quite explicit conversations about that, and we make sure that they have technologies of self-care to insulate themselves from that if they can, and to recognize when that's really not productive for them, but very productive for others. Things like setting boundaries, you know, definitely sort of saying, you know, having time when you're not responding to requests for work. I model that myself, and I've seen colleagues who've been very strict about that and said, after 5 o'clock, I do not answer my emails. And you maintain those boundaries for them, you model best practice for them, and that way they see someone who's gone ahead of them managing their own working life. And that's really super important, because if they look at each other, then they go frantic. But, you know, I think also just constantly stressing that you try to get them to realize that if they take their time and they're patient with their learning and they do it in the right order, then they will get there eventually. And also they've got plenty of time. I teach a mixture of mature students and first-year undergraduates, and the mature students are always really helpful to bring us a sense of reality on the course, because where they've been, you know, they've already had a career, or they've made life decisions, or they've had some real life experience, so they can play that back to the younger ones and say, well, actually, what it looks like for you now, that's not real. You know what I mean? That's an effect. Obviously, people are required to push themselves and be ambitious, but being ambitious doesn't mean staying up, you know, 24/7. I had one student who at one stage was doing so much Photoshop that he gave himself deep vein thrombosis and ended up in hospital. And it's like, well, why? You know, that's no help to anybody. So yeah, technologies of self-preservation, self-care, breathing, role model, playing that back to them, putting it in context of, you know, theory, actually talking about the economics and the politics of their current situation, so they can put it in a bigger picture.
Yeah, that's definitely true. We have lots of cases within our bachelor's degree with students are not so productive as they want to be, and they were nervous about that. So we definitely need to support them. One more question about learning processes. It's about what do you think, how it's important from UK perspective to start your learning journey as a student, to start your learning journey from BA level 6 or level 5, or you can start from MA as a more mature specialist, even changing your role from other art specializations. So what do you think? Where I need to start is I want to be a photographer.
There's that famous quote from Sebastião Salgado where he said that if anybody wants to go into documentary photography, they should first do a degree in politics. And to be honest, that's very sensible advice. I think the school system pushes people through this kind of production line mentality where, you know, you're gearing yourself towards going into education without any real life or real world experience. You know, taking a year out is actually a good thing. Doing a foundation course part-time is a good thing. You know, having a few years work behind you is an extremely good thing, because it means you put things in perspective, and you can't imagine what that's like if you just come off A-level and straight into university, unless you've actually had the good fortune to have done some jobs. Increasingly, students are a bit more savvy that way, though. Finding a lot more students nowadays have a working life before they come to uni, even if they're doing A-levels. It seems to be more normal than when I was in education. But there are those for whom it's just all about the stuff. It's a difficult question in terms of masters. You know, if you want to transition to a master's and you haven't done photography before, there are certain things that the first degree will give you, and the one thing that I always think is super important is an understanding of critical media theory, and, you know, the ability to be critical. what a degree gives you that a vocational qualification is less good at is the ability to question what it is that you're doing, and you innovate by questioning. So a good degree is not about learning the hard skills. You're also debating with each other constantly, and we do a lot of that. Last week I had a debate where we all, in Zoom, we were all in fancy dress pretending to be photographers and critics, and we had to sort of respond to each other as if we were in role. And that was great, because the students had to think, well, what would this other person say to this question? They had to put themselves into a role, which was great. And you model all these things for them. And with the way media are now, the amount of visual literacy that you have to take on board to understand some of those complex media messages, it's very hard to make that up unless you've had some direct contact with some theory, unless you've really kind of thought it through and you debated that. We have, to take networked media on without an understanding of critical thinking, it's a nightmare. So I would sort of say that that's the key thing. I'm talking from within my discipline. Within other disciplines, I can't say, but I would certainly say there's one idea that I had, which I'd really love to do at some stage, is to teach critical or visual culture studies or critical thinking to people who use networked media and photography and other disciplines, because it seems to be something that you do if you're in a humanities course, but everybody is now using images, and they're using them without thinking about how the image speaks, who it's speaking to, where it's coming from, how it uses visual language. People don't think about that unless they're taught very specific courses nowadays. But everybody is communicating via images. I don't know if that answers the question. A master's is fantastic. It's where I would always recommend that people do a degree and then take time out and then do a master's. You should never, ever, ever go through 3 years of degree and straight into a postgraduate, because you need experience. You need to be absolutely sure that you're doing that for the right reasons.
Yeah, thank you. I just remembered the line, one of our tutors from our BA programs told that you need to start this philosophy course before you enter your art education. And that really reminded me about what you said about politics.
I get that, but at the same time, I've seen that fail as well. I've seen people go first year, right, if you can't understand Heidegger, then you're no good, and that's terrible. But you're working with students in creative media. 25% of the students that you're working with are going to have dyslexia or some kind of learning or reading. So you've got to do the philosophy differently. You can't be so text heavy. You have to enact it. You have to play it. You have to theatricalize it, and not because you're trying to dumb it down, but because it doesn't exist unless it's communicated. And knowledge happens when you try to explain something to somebody else. So those people are absolutely, totally, the whole group needs to understand. It has to be totally inclusive. So yes, philosophy, but not the heavy Western canon thrown at you in year one, because that's no good. That's no good.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. So we are really end of the time, and it was very fascinating dialogue and really great lecture. Thank you a lot for just diving us deeper in understanding of how art education works. There is one more question, a little one. Is it possible to contact you somehow if there's some question about MA in South Bank University? Maybe you want to share some tips or advice, or maybe your opinion about the admission process, I suppose, or maybe someone.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy with you to share the email. We have various kind of research centres in South Bank University. The one I know the most about is the Centre for the Networked Image, which is run by Jeff Cox, and they do PhD supervision. They're putting together a collaborative masters at the moment with Whitechapel Gallery in London, which is in the stages of development, but it's barreling ahead. So I would say to contact me, and I'll pass the query on to Jeff, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you very much. So we will share your contacts when we will send the lecture materials or the recording of the Zoom meeting. Thank you very much. This was a great great meeting. Thanks all for participants who were with us all this period, and say thank you to Adam, please, in our chat. It will be great to share.
Thank you very much for
some goodbye and thanks, greetings. Thanks a lot, and bye then.
Okay, goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you so much, Sonia and Adam. Just I would like to remind you that if you would like to continue learning more about creative industries and meta skills, we would like to invite you to other sessions and lectures, because it was just the first lecture in the cycle of our lectures. I will switch to Russian. Дорогие друзья, мы хотели бы просто напомнить вам, что это только первое мероприятие в рамках цикла мероприятия, которое нас ждет. И Immersive Imaging, первый университет креативных индустрий в России, который объединяет на одной территории британскую высшую школу дизайна, школу разработки Scream School, Московскую школу кино, архитектурную школу Марш, Московскую школу музыки, школу предпринимательства Макс и школу для специалистов нового образования School of Education, Московскую школу еды. Мы вместе с культурным отделом культуры и образования Посольства Великобритании в Москве будем проводить цикл таких мероприятий, поэтому следите, пожалуйста, за нашими анонсами. Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much, and have a nice day. Great evening to all in Moscow, and great day for you because you're just in the middle of the day. So, thanks a lot.
Okay, good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.